There was a time when British kitchens hummed with the sounds of rattling tins, the pop of glass bottles, and the crinkle of wax paper wrapping around treats that seemed like they'd last forever. Families gathered around tables laden with foods that were as much a part of our national identity as red telephone boxes and Sunday roasts. But somewhere between the end of the 1970s and the dawn of a new decade, something shifted. Supermarket shelves were quietly rearranged, beloved brands vanished without fanfare, and the foods that had defined childhood tea times and Saturday treats simply disappeared. Most of us didn't notice at first. We were too busy moving forward. But now, decades later, the absence feels profound. If these memories stir something in you, do consider subscribing to Britain Rewind, because we're preserving what modern Britain has forgotten. Number 10. Spam fritters. Every chip shop worth its salt served spam fritters in the 1970s, those golden battered slices of processed meat that arrived at your table still sizzling, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. The taste was unmistakable, salty, savory, with that peculiar texture that somehow worked perfectly alongside a pile of chips and a splash of vinegar. Spam fritters weren't gourmet. They were honest, working-class sustenance that filled bellies without emptying wallets. But as Britain's culinary aspirations grew more sophisticated and health consciousness crept into the national conversation, the humble spam fritter became an embarrassment, a reminder of austerity and rationing that we were desperate to leave behind. By the mid-1980s, they'd vanished from most menus, dismissed as common, as poverty food, as something we no longer needed to be. Number 9. Rice-A-Riso. Rice-A-Riso promised something exotic in an era when foreign travel remained a luxury and most British households had never tasted authentic Mediterranean cuisine. Those bright yellow boxes with their illustrations of sun-drenched Italian villages represented adventure, sophistication, and the tantalizing possibility of bringing continental flair to a Middlesbrough semi-detached. The sachets contained pre-seasoned rice that supposedly transformed into risotto with minimal effort, though the result bore little resemblance to anything served in Milan. It tasted vaguely of chicken stock and turmeric, with a texture that veered between mushy and gritty. But we loved it anyway because it felt worldly. Rice-A-Riso disappeared as actual Italian restaurants proliferated and Britons began traveling abroad in numbers, discovering what real risotto actually tasted like and finding their beloved boxed version sadly wanting. Number 8. Jelly mousse. The jelly mousse was the centerpiece of every proper 1970s dinner party, wobbling majestically on its serving plate while hostesses prayed it wouldn't collapse before dessert was announced. Making one required patience, dissolving jelly cubes in boiling water, waiting for partial setting, then whisking in evaporated milk until the mixture transformed into something cloud-like and impossibly light. The result was a sweet, airy confection that tasted of artificial strawberry or lime and childhood birthday parties and mothers who had time to spend hours in the kitchen creating magic from packets. Jelly mousse vanished as convenience culture accelerated and dinner parties themselves became less formal, less structured, less essential to social standing. Nobody had time anymore to whisk and wait and hope. We wanted instant gratification, and jelly mousse required devotion. Number 7. Tin stewed steak. Frey Bentos and its competitors filled British cupboards with sturdy tins of stewed steak that promised a hot, filling meal without the expense of fresh meat from the butcher. The contents were controversial even then, grey chunks of beef swimming in thick, salty gravy that glistened with fat and gelatinized when cold. But warmed through and served with mashed potatoes and tin peas, it became Saturday lunch for millions of families, particularly those for whom a Sunday roast remained a weekly extravagance rather than an everyday possibility. The tin steak disappeared as frozen foods improved dramatically and microwaves made reheating convenient without requiring the distinctive metallic tang that meat always carried. We stopped accepting that preserved food had to taste preserved, that convenience required compromise. Supermarkets offered better options, and tin steak became history. Number 6. Arctic Roll. Arctic Roll arrived at tables like a small miracle, a spiral of vanilla sponge wrapped around vanilla ice cream, the whole thing dusted with desiccated coconut that stuck to your fingers and the roof of your mouth. Bird's Eye marketed it as sophisticated, but really it was wonderfully simple, the kind of dessert that required no skill beyond remembering to take it from the freezer 20 minutes before serving. Children adored it. Adults pretended it was beneath them while secretly enjoying every bite. The taste was pure sweetness and cold, and that peculiar texture contrast between soft sponge and frozen cream. Arctic roll faded as Britain's dessert culture evolved toward individual portions, restaurant-style plating, and treats that didn't require slicing and sharing. The communal dessert, it seemed, had become unfashionable. If these forgotten foods are bringing back memories you'd almost forgotten you had, please do subscribe to this channel. We're committed to preserving the Britain that once was, one memory at a time. Number 5. Cremola Foam. Cremola Foam was fizzy magic in a tin, a powder that transformed ordinary tap water into something that fizzed and foamed and tasted vaguely of fruit, though which fruit remained eternally debatable. Scottish children especially remember it, the distinctive tartan tin living in kitchen cupboards, dispensing spoonfuls of sherbet-like powder into glasses where it bubbled and hissed like a chemistry experiment. The foam rose dramatically, then subsided into a sweet, fizzy drink that bore no resemblance to any natural beverage but tasted exactly like childhood summers and garden parties and birthday treats. Cremola Foam disappeared in the early 1980s as concerns about artificial ingredients mounted and parents began questioning exactly what chemicals were creating those impressive bubbles. The tin vanished, but the memory of that foam remains remarkably persistent. Number 4. Cheese savouries. These weren't the elegant cheese biscuits you'd find in modern gastropubs. Cheese savouries were small, bright orange crackers that came in boxes and tasted overwhelmingly of artificial cheese flavouring and salt, the kind of thing you'd demolish by the handful while watching Saturday evening television. The texture was simultaneously crispy and slightly greasy, leaving orange dust on your fingers that you'd lick away without thinking. Families kept them alongside cream crackers and water biscuits, but cheese savouries were never meant for topping with actual cheese. They were the cheese, concentrated and intensified to almost absurd levels. They disappeared as snacking became more sophisticated and the bright orange color that once signaled fun began signaling something vaguely toxic, something we shouldn't be putting in our bodies quite so enthusiastically. Number 3. Instant Whip. Bird's Instant Whip represented everything wonderful and terrible about 1970s food technology, dessert that required only milk and whisking, emerging in minutes as something fluffy and sweet and entirely artificial. The flavors were strawberry, chocolate, or butterscotch, though none tasted particularly like their namesakes. What they tasted like was childhood, was convenience, was mothers who worked and needed quick solutions, was a decade that embraced synthetic without shame. The whip set in the refrigerator into something mousse-like, served in glass dishes that showed off the uniform color and texture. Instant Whip vanished as we became suspicious of foods that transformed too quickly, of desserts that listed more chemicals than recognizable ingredients. We wanted authenticity, even if it meant more work, more time, more expense. Number 2. Pacers. Pacers were mint chews that arrived in distinctive green wrappers, each sweet striped with white and green like tiny toothpaste tubes compressed into chewable form. The flavor was intensely minty, almost medicinal, the kind of sweet that cleared your sinuses and made your eyes water if you chewed too enthusiastically. But that intensity was precisely the point. Pacers weren't gentle or subtle. They were bold, assertive, the kind of sweet you bought to prove you could handle them. Opal fruits and marathon bars get more nostalgic attention, but those of us who remember Pacers remember something specific, the particular burn of that mint, the way it lingered for hours, the green and white wrappers scattered across school playgrounds. They disappeared in the early 1980s, replaced by nothing quite the same. Number 1. Spangles. If one sweet encapsulates everything we've lost, it's Spangles. Those square boiled sweets came in flavors that defined an era, Old English, which tasted mysteriously of herbs and history, barley sugar, golden and comforting, and fruit flavors that bore creative relationships with actual fruit. The wrappers were miniature works of art, each flavor distinctively designed, collectible, tradable in school corridors like currency. Spangles weren't just sweets. They were institutions, as British as anything could be, manufactured by Mars but feeling entirely, authentically ours. When they disappeared in 1984, replaced by the rounder, softer opal fruits that would themselves eventually become Starburst, something shifted in British confectionery culture. We were being globalized without quite realizing it, our distinctive treats replaced by internationally marketable alternatives. Spangles represented a Britain that made things its own way, for its own people, without apology. Their disappearance marked an ending we're still processing. Before we close, let's remember the foods we couldn't quite fit: Texan bars with their cowboy swagger, Five Boys chocolate that came in distinctive wrappers showing a child's changing expression, banjo bars that promised peanut satisfaction, Crown mints in their regal packaging, and Trayets that melted in your mouth, not in your hand, before M&Ms made that slogan internationally famous. Each one carried memories worth preserving. These foods didn't just disappear because of changing tastes or improved manufacturing or health concerns, though those factors all played their parts. They vanished because the Britain that created them, that needed them, that loved them, also vanished. We became wealthier, more connected to global culture, more suspicious of artificial ingredients and convenience foods. We gained sophistication but lost something precious, that uncomplicated enjoyment of simple pleasures, that willingness to embrace the unpretentious and the ordinary. In the comments below, tell us which of these foods you remember most vividly. Tell us what you miss. Tell us what your childhood tasted like. Because these memories, shared between us, are all that remain of a Britain that exists now only in our collective remembering. Let's keep it alive together.